Alberto lived in a spacious attic apartment with sloping walls flooded. A sharp light directly from the sky flooded the room from a skylight set into one of the walls. There was also another window facing the town. Through this window, Sophie could look over all the roofs in the old town. But what amazed Sophie most was all the stuff the room was filled with. Furniture and objects from various historical periods. There was a sofa from the 30s, an old desk from the beginning of the century, and a chair that had to be hundreds of years old. But it wasn't just the furniture. Old objects, either useful or decorative, were jumbled together on shelves and cupboard. There were old clocks, vases, mortars and retorts, knives and dolls, quill pens and bookends, octants and sextants, compasses and barometers. An entire wall was covered with books, but not the sort of books found in most bookstores. The book collection itself was a cross-section of the production of many hundreds of years. On the other walls hung drawings and paintings, some from recent decades, but most of them also very old. "What a lot of old junk you've collected," she said. "Now then, just think of how many centuries of histories I have preserved in this room. I wouldn't exactly call it junk. Do you manage an antique shop or something?" Alberto looked almost pained. "We can't all let ourselves be washed away by the tide of history, Sophie. Some of us must tarry in order to gather up what has been left along the river banks." What an odd thing to say. Yes, but nonetheless true, child. We do not live in our own time alone. We carry our history within us. Don't forget that everything you see in this room was once brand new. That old 16th century wooden doll might have been made for a 5-year-old girl's birthday by her old grandfather. Maybe. Then she became a teenager, then an adult, and then she married. Maybe she had a daughter of her own and gave the doll to her. She grew old, and one day she died, although she had lived for a very long time. One day she was dead and gone, and she will never return. Actually, she was only here for a short visit. But her doll, well, there it is, on the shelf. Everything sounds so sad and solemn when you talk like that. Life is both sad and solemn. We are let into a wonderful world. We meet one another here, greet each other, and wander together for a brief moment. Then we lose each other and disappear as suddenly and unreasonably as we arrived. May I ask you something? We're not playing hide and seek anymore. Why did you move into the major's cabin? So that we would be so far from each other when we were only talking by letter. I knew the old cabin would be empty. So you just moved in? That's right, I moved in. Then maybe you can explain how Helda's father knew you were here. If I'm right, he knows practically everything. But I still can't understand at all how you get a mailman to deliver mail in the middle of the woods. Alberto smiled archly. Even things like that are pure bagatelle for Helda's father. Cheap hocus pocus. Simple sleight of hand. We are living under what is possibly the world's closest surveillance. Sophie could feel herself getting angry. If I ever meet him, I'll scratch his eyes out. Alberto walked over and sat down on the sofa. Sophie followed and sank into a deep armchair. Only philosophy can bring us closer to Hilda's father, Alberto said at last. Today, I shall tell you about the Renaissance. Not very long after St. Thomas Aquinas, cracks began to appear in the unifying culture of Christianity. Philosophy and science broke away more and more from the theology of the church, thus enabling religious life to attain a freer relationship to reasoning. More people now emphasize that we cannot reach God through rationalism because God is in all ways unknowable. The important thing for a man was not to understand the divine mystery, but to submit to God's will. as religion and science could now relate more freely to each other. The way was open both to new scientific methods and a new religious fervor. Thus, the basis was created for two powerful upheaval in the 15th and 17th centuries, namely the Renaissance and the Reformation. Can we take them one at a time? By the Renaissance, we mean the rich cultural development that began in the late 14th century. It started in northern Italy and spread rapidly northward during the 15th and the 16th centuries. Didn't you tell me that the word Renaissance meant rebirth? I did indeed. And that which was to be reborn was the art and culture of antiquity. We also speak of Renaissance humanism, since now, after the long dark ages in which every aspect of life was seen through divine light, everything once again revolved around man. Go to the source was the motto, and that meant the humanism of antiquity first and foremost. It almost became a popular pastime to dig up ancient sculptures and scrolls, just as it became fashionable to learn Greek. The study of Greek humanism also had a pedagogical aim. The study of Greek humanism also had a pedagogical aim. Reading humanistic subjects provided a classical education and developed what may be called human qualities. Horses are born, it was said, but human beings are not born, they are formed. Do we have to be educated to be human beings? Yes, that was the thought. But before we take a closer look at the ideas of Renaissance humanism, we may say a little about the political and cultural background of the Renaissance. Alberto rose from the sofa and began to wander about the room. After a while, he paused and pointed to the antique instrument on one of the shelves. "What is it?" he asked. "It looks like an old compass." "Quite right." He then pointed to an ancient firearm hanging on the wall above the sofa. "And that? An old-fashioned rifle?" "Exactly." "And this?" Alberto pulled a large book off one of the bookshelves. "It's an old book. To be absolutely precise, it is an incunabulum." An incunabulum, actually, it means cradle. The word is used about books printed to the cradle days of painting. That is, before 15. Is it really that old? That old, yes. And these three discoveries, the compass, firearms, and the printing press, were essential preconditions for this new period we call the Renaissance. You'll have to explain that a bit more clearly. The compass made it easier to navigate. In other words, it was the basis of the great voyages of discovery. So were firearms in a way. The new weapons gave the Europeans military superiority over American and Asiatic cultures. Although firearms were also an important factor in Europe, printing played an important part in spreading the Renaissance humanists' new ideas, not least. And the art of printing was not least one of the factors that forced the church to relinquish its former position as sole disseminator of knowledge. New inventions and instruments began to follow thick and fast. One important instrument, for example, was the telescope, which resulted in completely new basis for astronomy. And finally came rockets and space probes. Now we're going too fast. We could say that the process started in the Renaissance finally brought people to the moon, or for that matter, to Hiroshima and Chernobyl. However, it all began with changes on the culture and economic front. An important condition was the transition from a subsistence economy to a monetary economy. Toward the end of the Middle Ages, cities had developed with effective trades and a lively commerce of new goods, a monetary economy and banking. A middle class arose which developed a certain freedom with regard to the basic conditions of life. Necessities became something that could be bought for money. This state of affairs eroded people's diligence imagination, and ingenuity. New demands were made on the individual. It's a bit like the way Greek cities developed 2000 years earlier. Not altogether untrue. I told you how Greek philosophy broke away from the mythological world picture that was linked to peasants' culture. In the same way, the Renaissance middle class began to break away from the feudal lords and the power of the church. As this was happening, Greek culture was being rediscovered through a closer contact with the Arabs in Spain and the Byzantine culture in the East. Three diverging streams from antiquity joined into one great river. You are an attentive pupil. That gives you some background on the Renaissance. I shall now tell you about the new ideas. Okay, I'll have to go home and eat. Alberto sat down on the sofa again. He looked at Sophie. Above all else, the Renaissance resulted in a new view of mankind. The humanism of the Renaissance was brought a new belief in man and his worth, in striking contrast to the biased medieval emphasis on the sinful nature of man. Man was now considered infinitely great and valuable. One of the central figures of the Renaissance was Marsilio Ficino. Know thyself, O divine lineage, immortal guise. Another central figure wrote the oration on the dignity of man, something that would have been unthinkable in the Middle Ages. Throughout the whole medieval period, the point of departure had always been God. The humanists of the Renaissance took as their point of departure man himself. But so did the Greek philosophers. That is precisely why we speak of a rebirth of antiquities to humanism. But Renaissance humanism was to an even greater extent characterized by individualism. We are not only human beings, we are unique individuals. This idea could then lead to an almost unrestrained worship of genius. The ideal became what we call the Renaissance man, a man of universal genius, embracing all aspects of life, art and science. The new view of man also manifested itself in an interest in the human anatomy. As in ancient times, people once again began to dissect the dead to discover how the body was constructed. It was imperative both for medical science and for art. Once again, it became usual for works of art to depict the nude. High time, after 1,000 years of prudery, man was bold enough to be himself again. There was no longer anything to be ashamed of. It sounds intoxicating, Sophie said, leaning her arms on the little table that stood between her and the philosopher. Undeniably, the new view of mankind led to a whole new outlook. Man did not exist purely for God's sake. Man could therefore delight in life here and now. And with this new freedom to develop, the possibilities were limitless. The aim was to exceed all boundaries. This was also a new idea, seen from the Greek humanistic point of view. The humanists of antiquity had emphasized the importance of tranquility, moderation, and restraint. And the Renaissance humanists lost their restraint. They were certainly not especially moderate. They behaved as if the whole world had been reawakened. They became intensely conscious of their epoch, which is what led them to introduce the term Middle Ages to cover the centuries between antiquity and their own time. There was an unrivaled development in all spheres of life. Art and architecture, lifetime, music, philosophy and science flourished as never before. I will mention one concrete example. We have spoken of ancient Rome, which gloried in titles such as the city of the cities and the hub of the universe. During the Middle Ages, the city declined, and by 1417, the old metropolis had only 17,000 inhabitants, not much more than Lyle Sand where elders lived. The Renaissance humanists saw it as their cultural duty to restore Rome. First and foremost, to begin the construction of the great St. Peter's Church over the grave of Peter and Apostle. And St. Peter's Church can boast neither of moderation nor restraint. Many great artists of the Renaissance took part in building projects, the greatest in the world. It began in 15 and lasted for 100 years, and it took another 50 before the huge St. Peter's Square was completed. It must be a gigantic church. It is over 200 meters long and 130 meters high, and it covers an area of more than 16 square meters. But enough about the boldness of the Renaissance man.